Ethan Brooks always says there are two kinds of people in the world: the ones who threaten you because they think you have nothing left to fight with, and the ones who quietly walk back into the house, unlock an old filing cabinet, and let the paperwork do the talking. The morning my homeowners association mailed me a foreclosure notice for property they claimed I owed them $3,400 over, I laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee across my kitchen counter, not because it was funny, but because the clubhouse they'd spent almost $1 million building was sitting on land my family had never sold. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 53 years old, and after 30 years managing municipal water infrastructure outside Fort Worth, Texas, I retired believing the hardest battles of my life were behind me. Turns out retirement just meant my opponents stopped wearing hard hats and started wearing polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo. My grandparents bought our ranch in 1978, long before subdivisions swallowed what used to be open pasture, and growing up, I learned every fence line, every oak tree, every drainage ditch by heart. My father wasn't sentimental about much, but whenever we walked the property, he'd point toward the eastern ridge and say, "Land remembers who takes care of it. Son, never let paperwork leave your hands." At the time, I thought it sounded like something old farmers told their kids because they liked hearing themselves talk. Years later, I'd realize it was the smartest advice he ever gave me. In 2020, a developer approached me with an offer to purchase most of our unused acreage for a new neighborhood called Willow Ridge Estates. I wasn't interested at first, but my wife, Melissa, reminded me that we didn't need all that land anymore. Our daughters had families of their own, the cattle were gone, and maintaining dozens of acres just for memories wasn't practical forever. We negotiated for months, and eventually I agreed to sell almost everything except a narrow 1.8-acre strip that contained an old equipment shed, a small access road, and the highest part of the property where my father loved watching sunsets. The developer didn't argue. Their surveyor marked the boundary. Attorneys drafted the documents. Everybody signed, shook hands, and moved on. I honestly believed the chapter of my life was over. For nearly 2 years, I barely paid attention as houses sprang up one after another. Every now and then I'd drive past and think the neighborhood looked nice enough. Families were moving in. Kids rode bicycles along fresh sidewalks. And honestly, I hoped they'd enjoy living there. Then one Thursday morning, I heard diesel engines before sunrise. I walked outside expecting utility crews, but instead I found excavators, dump trucks, and a construction foreman directing equipment across the edge of my retained parcel like he'd been doing it his entire life. I parked my truck beside the entrance and walked over. "Morning," I said. "Mind telling me what you're building?" The foreman glanced at a clipboard without even looking at me. "Community clubhouse and storm shelters. We're on a schedule." I smiled politely. "You sure you're in the right place?" He pointed toward laminated site plans. "Everything's approved through the HOA and developer." I looked at the map for maybe 5 seconds before handing it back. Interesting. He probably expected an argument, maybe yelling or threats. Instead, I wished him a good day, climbed back into my truck, and drove home. Melissa looked up from the breakfast table when I came inside. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Maybe," I answered, pouring another cup of coffee. "Or maybe somebody just made the most expensive mistake in this county." She knew me well enough not to push. After all those years managing public infrastructure, she'd watched contractors argue over inches that later became lawsuits worth millions. She simply nodded and asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked out the kitchen window toward the tree line where my father used to stand every evening. "Nothing," I said quietly. "Not yet." Over the next several months, I never interfered. I watched concrete trucks arrive, steel beams rise into the sky, and 6 reinforced tornado shelters take shape beside an elegant stone clubhouse complete with a covered patio, fitness room, and meeting hall. Every weekend the board posted cheerful updates on social media about their incredible new amenities, thanking residents for supporting nearly $1 million in community improvements. Every time I saw another photo, I felt the same strange mix of disbelief and curiosity. How had nobody checked the property records? How had no surveyor caught it? Or worse, had someone checked and simply assumed I would never notice? Those questions stayed in my head until one quiet October afternoon when I unlocked the old filing cabinet in my garage, the one my father insisted we'd never throw away, and pulled out a yellow folder that hadn't been touched since closing day. Inside were the original deed, the recorded survey, every signed exhibit, and one sentence that would change everything. I spread every document across my workbench and spent the next 2 hours reading them the same way I used to inspect engineering blueprints before approving a multi-million-dollar project. Slowly, carefully, and without assuming anybody else had done their job correctly. The original survey matched the recorded deed down to the inch. The legal description clearly reserved my 1.8-acre parcel, and the county GIS map showed exactly the same thing. Just to remove every ounce of doubt, I hired an independent surveying firm with no connection to the developer, the county, or the HOA. Their crew spent 3 days marking boundaries with GPS equipment, metal detectors, and old monuments buried decades earlier. When the lead surveyor, Daniel Pierce, called me the following Friday, his first sentence wasn't, "We found a small discrepancy." It was, "Mr. Brooks, you should probably sit down." I laughed and told him I already was. "How bad is it?" There was a long pause before he answered. "The clubhouse, every tornado shelter, most of the parking lot, and part of the walking trail are all inside your parcel." I looked back at the photos the HOA proudly posted online every week. Smiling families celebrating progress, board members cutting ceremonial ribbons, everyone convinced they owned something they had never legally possessed. "You're certain?" I asked. Daniel almost sounded offended. I'd stake my license on it. I thanked him, paid the invoice the same afternoon. And still, I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the news. I didn't post anything online. Melissa looked at me over dinner and asked the question everyone else eventually asked. "Why are you waiting?" I shrugged. "Because reasonable people deserve a chance to fix unreasonable mistakes." So I wrote a respectful certified letter to the HOA president, a man named Grant Holloway. I'd never met him, but neighbors describe him as the kind of retired executive who confused authority with ownership. My letter was simple. I enclosed copies of the survey, invited the board to meet, and proposed negotiating an easement or long-term lease that would protect every homeowner from future legal headaches. I even ended with, "I'm confident we can solve this professionally." 30 days passed. Nothing. 60 days. Still nothing. 90 days later, the green certified mail receipt was the only proof anyone had ever seen my letter. Then, on a rainy February afternoon, my mailbox delivered something far more interesting. A law firm representing Willow Ridge Estates HOA claimed I owed $3,400 in unpaid assessments and warned that failure to comply could result in foreclosure proceedings against my property. I read every page twice before Melissa noticed the smile spreading across my face. "That's not a normal smile," she said cautiously. "No," I answered. "That's the smile of somebody watching another man dig his own hole." The following Monday, their attorney called. His voice carried that polished confidence lawyers sometimes have before discovering they don't know the whole story. "Mr. Brooks, we prefer to resolve this without litigation." "So would I replied. "Wonderful. Then we'd appreciate payment by the end of the month." I leaned back in my chair. "Before we discuss money, can I ask you one question?" "Certainly. Have you ever physically visited the clubhouse you're trying to collect dues for?" He hesitated. "That's not relevant." "Actually, it is." I emailed him the deed, the fresh survey, and the county parcel overlay while we were still on the phone. 30 seconds later, the conversation became unusually quiet. I could almost hear him scrolling through the documents. Finally, he cleared his throat. I'll need to discuss these with my client." "Please do," I said calmly. "And while you're discussing them, ask who authorized construction on land they didn't own." He ended the call less than a minute later. I assumed someone from the HOA would reach out. Nobody did. Instead, 2 weeks later, the board posted cheerful advertisements promoting their annual spring festival at the new clubhouse, complete with food trucks, live music, bounce houses, and emergency preparedness demonstrations inside the tornado shelters. That's when I realized something important. They weren't ignoring me because they thought I was wrong. They were ignoring me because admitting I was right would expose an expensive mistake that no one wanted residents to discover. Melissa found me staring at the flyer one evening. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I folded the paper in half. "I'm thinking they still believe I'll blink first." She smiled. "Are you going to?" I looked toward the steel fabrication shop I'd worked with years earlier on municipal security projects. Not this time. 3 weeks later, a 12-foot powder-coated steel security gate stood across the only legal entrance to my retained parcel. It wasn't ugly or aggressive. In fact, it looked surprisingly elegant, supported by native limestone columns with discrete security cameras mounted overhead. Instead of a chain and padlock, I installed a commercial biometric access system connected to backup power. Only 2 fingerprints could open it, mine and Melissa's. Every permit had been approved. Every setback requirement had been met. Every installation had been inspected. I wasn't blocking a public road. I wasn't interfering with emergency services. I was simply controlling access to my own property, exactly as any landowner has the legal right to do. The festival committee didn't notice until Saturday morning. By 8 o'clock, dozens of vehicles were lined up outside the entrance. Parents unloaded folding chairs. Children carried soccer balls. Fruit vendors called confused event organizers asking why they couldn't reach the clubhouse. Then someone discovered the gate. I watched everything from my pickup parked beneath an old oak tree nearly 300 yards away. Nobody noticed me at first. Grant Holloway eventually stormed across the grass with 2 other board members close behind. His face was bright red before he even reached the gate. "Open this immediately," he shouted. I remained seated on the tailgate, sipping coffee. "Morning. Grant, you can't do this." "Do what?" "Block community property." I slowly stood, walked to the fence line, and held up my deed without crossing onto the road. "Actually, I'm protecting private property." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "This land belongs to the association." "Then you won't mind if we ask the county surveyor to settle it right now?" His confidence cracked for the first time. One board member whispered something into his ear. Another stared silently at the boundary markers my survey crew had installed months earlier. Grant pointed toward the clubhouse. "There are families waiting." "I know," I answered. "That's why I tried contacting you 4 months ago." "You could have called." "I did better than that. I sent certified mail." Before he could respond, a local television news van rolled into the growing line of stopped traffic. Apparently, several frustrated residents had already called the station complaining that the HOA's expensive new clubhouse had mysteriously become inaccessible. A young reporter stepped out carrying a microphone and asked the simplest question anyone had asked all morning. "Sir, why is the gate locked?" I smiled politely, reached into the folder tucked under my arm, and handed her 3 documents: the recorded deed, the independent survey, and the foreclosure notice the HOA had mailed me just weeks earlier. She looked down, then back up at the massive stone clubhouse sitting quietly behind the locked gate, and I could almost see the headline forming in her mind. The story aired that evening, and by sunrise the entire county seemed to know 2 things. Someone had built a luxury clubhouse on land they didn't own, and the same HOA responsible for the mistake had threatened to foreclose on the actual landowner. My phone never stopped buzzing. Former coworkers, neighbors, even people I hadn't spoken to in years, all wanted to know if the television report had exaggerated the situation. I kept giving everyone the same answer: no. If anything, they left out the boring legal parts. By Monday morning, the county attorney's office announced a formal review into the subdivision's permitting history, and just 2 days later, the HOA received notice that its authority to issue new fines, liens, or foreclosure actions would be temporarily suspended while investigators examined whether the board had knowingly acted outside its legal authority. That's when panic finally reached Grant Holloway. Until then, he'd spoken through lawyers, property managers, and strongly worded letters. This time, he drove to my house himself. I saw his SUV coming down the gravel driveway and told Melissa, "Looks like somebody finally decided certified mail works both ways." Grant stepped out looking 10 years older than the man who had shouted across the gate only days before. The confidence was gone. The expensive sunglasses were gone. Even his voice sounded different. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. I invited him onto the porch, offered him iced tea, and for nearly a minute neither of us spoke. Finally he sighed. "What will it take to fix this?" I slid a prepared folder across the table. "A lease." He opened it slowly. 10 years. $6,400 a month, $20,000 due at signing to cover legal expenses, surveying costs, and property improvements. One clause, printed in bold, stated that payments more than 15 days late would trigger automatic closure of the access gate, and if the agreement remained in default for 30 consecutive days, all rights to occupy the clubhouse and shelters would immediately terminate until the breach was cured. Grant rubbed his forehead. "You're putting us in a difficult position." I couldn't help smiling. "Grant, you mailed me foreclosure papers over money I never owed, while your association was holding meetings on property you never owned. Compared to that, I'd say this is generous." He looked out toward the road where families were driving home from school. "There are 350 households depending on us. I nodded. Exactly. Which is why I tried solving this privately 4 months ago. He never argued after that. The board called an emergency meeting the following week. Residents packed every available chair. And according to 3 homeowners who later introduced themselves to me, the discussion lasted nearly 4 hours. Some demanded a lawsuit against me. Others wanted Grant removed immediately. Then someone projected the county's survey onto a large screen, followed by copies of my original certified letter that had quietly disappeared into HOA records months earlier. The room reportedly went silent. By the end of the evening, the vote wasn't even close. The association approved the lease by an overwhelming margin, not because they suddenly liked me, but because facts don't negotiate. 18 days later, Grant resigned as president after his professional liability insurer informed him they would not defend claims involving intentional misrepresentation or improper foreclosure actions. The board hired new legal counsel, replaced the management company, and adopted a policy requiring independent title verification before approving any future construction projects. The first lease payment arrived by wire transfer on the first day of July, exactly 9:12 that morning. Melissa checked the account before I did and walked onto the porch with a grin. Looks like they finally found the right property owner. We both laughed, not because we enjoyed watching people fail, but because the whole mess could have been avoided by one honest conversation. A few weeks later, the new HOA president asked whether I would permanently leave the gate open. I told her yes. There was never any satisfaction in keeping children away from a playground or families away from community events. The gate had never been about punishment. It had been about getting someone's attention after every polite attempt had failed. Today, the clubhouse is still there. The shelters are still protecting families during storm season. Every monthly payment has arrived on time, and every interaction I've had with the new board has been respectful, professional, and surprisingly friendly. Sometimes people ask if I regret not forcing them to tear everything down. Honestly, no. Buildings can be rebuilt. Trust takes much longer. The foreclosure notice they once mailed me now sits framed inside my home office next to the signed lease. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that arrogance has a funny way of creating its own consequences. My father used to tell me that land remembers who takes care of it. I think he was right, but I'd add one more lesson after everything that happened. Paperwork remembers too, and unlike pride, it doesn't forget, it doesn't get emotional, and it doesn't care who thinks they're in charge. So now I'm curious what you think. If you had been standing in my boots, would you have locked the gate the moment you discovered the mistake? Or would you have kept trying to negotiate the way I did? Was the HOA treated fairly, or did they simply face the consequences of their own decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand.